Thank you, Treasurer, for a most insightful presentation, and congratulations on delivering an impressive budget which shows the Queensland economy now bigger than before the pandemic, with a strong economic growth of 2.75% per annum projected over the next 4 years, and a surplus forecast in 2024-25. Impressive indeed. We're going to open the floor up to sort of questions. As Tanya said earlier, you can ask questions via the Pigeonhole app. You can also vote for the most popular question through the app as well, or alternatively, we can look at sort of getting a mic around the room if you've got some questions, and just raise your hand, please. When asking questions, if you can just state your name and your organisation, and if you can keep the question as brief as possible to allow as many questions. I might kick off myself if that's okay, Treasurer. I did take away the one stat that you asked us to, which is the 110 billion of infrastructure investment by 24-25. I'm interested to understand, what role do you see private finance has in supporting the economic growth of the state? And what do you see the public-private partnership procurement model playing a role in the delivery of that over that period of time?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And as I think you rightly indicated in your introductory remarks, we've had a strong relationship with the private sector in relation to a number of big projects around Queensland, schools, the Sunshine Coast University Hospital, which I was very proud to open safely, on time, as the then Health Minister. And of course, a couple of funds that we've announced in the budget. So the $1 billion Housing Fund, so that will draw down, we'll draw down the returns on that fund each year, and that will provide stability and certainty, particularly for private sector investors. So for private investment, if we'll be using that investment to provide some perhaps sharing risk, provide a certain return to enable more roofs to go over more Queenslanders' heads. We know some people, the impact of our economic activity and the impact of COVID has meant some people are facing the challenge of finding a place to call their home, their own home, a place to call home. So we want to use that, and that's, I think, a great way we can partner. And then we'll look at our hospital building fund. So one of the first investments we've announced, it is because of demand, not because that the Assistant Treasurer is the member for Jordan, the new Mater Hospital in Springfield, a part of Queensland that's growing incredibly. Most of Queensland's growing at 1.5% a year. The population in that Western Corridor, for any of those people who know that, growing at about 3.5%. So we're partnering with Mater to purchase services for a new public hospital there. New emergency department, 174 beds, $177 million out of that fund this year. And then that will provide, over time, there'll be $1 billion that will go into that hospital over a decade to help with capital costs, but also with the delivery of recurrent medical and surgical services and ED services. And then we're taking some money from that fund to build the new day surgery facility, I should say, up in Toowoomba, the old Bailey Henderson campus. So there's money will be going into that in this budget. And so building on the pathway that we've worked with the private sector before on, including Airport Link, other big projects like that, I think there's plenty of opportunity in the social infrastructure space as well as the hard economic infrastructure space to work together. And so through the investment team in my department, we've got an investment facilitation partnership and commercial team in Treasury. As part of my role as the Minister for Investment, we're always working through those proposals, and we would welcome those. We would welcome those to see how that might suit the needs of our government, but more particularly the needs of Queenslanders going forward.
Great, thank you. If I can just turn perhaps to the pandemic. Clearly it's a difficult time to put together a budget, and it's not just the uncertainty on the economic sort of forecasting, but it's predicting things like vaccine rates, when the international borders might open. The Palaszczuk government prioritised the health response during the peak of the pandemic, and as such, the economic sort of recovery has been a bit quicker than other states. In preparing the budget, what sort of assumptions have you made around the sort of the pandemic for the future?
Yeah, we've leveraged off some of the assumptions in the federal budget. So opening of international borders, vaccination rates or delivery and rates. We've just used the information that the Commonwealth's provided to us because they are, of course, responsible for both of those issues. We're doing our best as a state to support the federal government in the delivery of vaccines now to Queenslanders, and if there's one message that I would send to everyone today, make sure you get whatever vaccine's available to you. That's going to be critical to reopening our economy, continue to see the recovery. We saw those restrictions eased again yesterday, the announcement the Premier made, particularly for hospitality venues, which I think is another step forward for our state. But to make sure we don't go backwards, we need to ensure that people are as safe as possible. I suppose prioritising the health of Queensland, it was the number one strategy in our economic recovery plan, and it's now a number one government priority, making sure we protect the health of Queenslanders. That's the number one assumption that we will adopt. It's our number one priority, it's our number one commitment, so we will continue to ensure we do whatever we need to keep Queenslanders safe. But I think as you heard, the brief lockdowns we had earlier in the year, that had a very limited impact on economic activity. So if we can get that balance right, we don't want to unnecessarily put constraints on individuals or businesses or families, but we've got to make sure the virus doesn't get away, because if you can suppress the virus, you can free your people, and that's been demonstrated now time and time again across the world, and you also free your economy as a consequence of that. So making sure we give that priority, but make sure Queenslanders stay healthy, but also put the mechanisms in place, particularly vaccine delivery, to enable that to occur.
Great. Is there anyone on the floor wanting to raise their hand? I've got a few sort of questions that have come through the app. I think there's one over the back there. We'll just get a mic across to you.
Thank you very much. Growth is great, inflation isn't. I wondered if you could just comment on the outlook for inflation. Some of the hottest sectors at the moment are already experiencing some B2B inflation. Do you have any comments to make about that?
I think you'll see inflation and interest rates coming back faster than we anticipated, but I'll leave that to perhaps some people more eminently qualified than me. But I do think there's some activity happening there, and I think if we can, as a nation, continue to suppress the virus as the vaccine delivery continues to accelerate. I think we've had 4 record delivery days in Queensland so far. Each day we're breaking new vaccination records, and that's happened, I think, 4 days in a row now, or four business days, 4 working days in a row. I'm not sure about the numbers on the weekend. Then I think you'll just see the economy starting to not so much heat up, but economic activity continue to accelerate. And I think that may have an impact on where inflation's going. But I think your observations are pretty spot on about some of that movement already, which may very well continue. So we'll continue to watch that. All of the treasurers meet regularly. An organisation or group called the Council on Federal Financial Relations, with the Federal Treasurer and all state and territory treasurers. A very large number of First Ministers are on that. The Premier of Tasmania, Chief Minister in the ACT and the Northern Territory, and now the Premier of WA are all treasurers. So we'll be working very closely, and that links then well with the National Cabinet. So we'll keep an eye on that at that level too.
Any other questions from the floor? I've got a couple here, Treasurer, on the app. One from Ian Henderson. Alan Tudge acknowledged Queensland universities as the best in Australia for research commercialisation. With very large investment from other state governments in research, how will Queensland remain competitive?
Yeah, I think we'll continue to do our bit as a state. The platform that we're seeing that was built by the Beattie Labor government in particular, but it was being driven through the Bligh government and now through our government through the Advanced Queensland program, I think has put us in a great position as a state to leverage that world-class research, as I said, that comes out of Queensland institutions. But how we do what we've always dreamt of doing in our country, making sure that we can take the natural resources, whether they be the human intellectual capability or the resources from the earth, and then convert that into value adding for our people, I think that there's a real opportunity for us now in the manufacturing space. That's a very clear message. You know, who would have thought a very large proportion of the world's face masks would have been made in Wuhan, one of the epicenters of the pandemic. And then we saw those, when I was the Minister for State Development, we saw those links in that supply chain were just snapped overnight. And that put our people, it put our health workers, it put our frontline health staff at that time, when the pandemic started, very much at the risk of very significant human loss. And so we don't want to expose them to that again. So I think that mindset, we like to make it in Queensland, we like to buy things with that big maroon stamp on it that says made in Queensland. I think now's the opportunity. But partnering with our universities, who've done some of the brilliant world-leading research, and then how do we commercialise that now? How do we take the idea and convert it? And that's why I'm so happy about the Translational Manufacturing Institute. I think that's going to be a national leader. I raised 6 years ago when I was Health Minister the need for us to make vaccines in Australia. We had trouble getting supply of whooping cough vaccine, which I then found is made in 2 places in the world. I think it was 2 at the time. One of them was Poland. And so a terrible illness, particularly for infants and young children. And I was deeply concerned then that we would have a breach in the supply chain. And the federal government ignored me effectively. Now, can you imagine if we'd built that capacity to do mRNA vaccines or other vaccine production, where we would have been situated last year? So it's not just the brilliance of the ideas, it's making it real for people and making that manufacturing capability. So that's why our funds will be focused on that, and we'll be looking forward to working with our university partners as well. I know some of them are here today.
Thank you. Another one on the app, Treasurer. The budget seems light on digital investment and associated policies like we see in other jurisdictions. How are you thinking about using technology to improve service delivery?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one I think perhaps we're going to have to think more about and look a little bit more at down the road. I've spoken to some leaders in the digital space, so I think that's something where we probably need to close the gap a bit faster for Queensland. I think other jurisdictions, as much as I don't like to admit it, there might be a couple of jurisdictions in Queensland that are doing pretty well in that space, so I think we can learn from that. The digital enablement of citizens' interactions with government. I think we're all seeing that in whatever area or part of the economy we're in, whether it's our own business, you know, whether it's at an industry-wide level. There is so much thinking that's happening in that space, and we're going to have to look carefully at that. And then you know, our fibre network that we established, how do we leverage off that even more? But how do we then move to the next level as a government? I think that's going to be a fair bit of thought that we'll put into that over the next budget cycle. I can't say that it will result in any more significant investment at this stage. Can I just get through this budget? And then we'll look to see what we do next year. But it's certainly a strong message that I'm receiving from the private sector. So we'll continue to work together on that.
Right. Any more questions from the floor? No, I'll keep moving on with the app. One from Anna Daniel. Can you please tell us more about the fantastic $350 million industry partnership program to increase SMEs innovation and collaboration with public researchers?
Yeah, so again, building on that experience that we've had now as a government to try and leverage that investment. I suppose we're looking more flexibly at how we might use public funds. It still has to have a high threshold of integrity around it because it ultimately is public money. We want to see a return on our investment if we can in a number of areas. But using some of our great institutions like QIC, you know, a great Queensland institution that we should all be proud of, not just a funds manager, but an entity that can help us partner and support the growth of all sectors of business. So the Invest in Queensland program is very much focused on the big fish, trying to get some of them on the hook, and then looking at small and medium-sized enterprises as well. So again, we're soliciting, we've worked, I think, with 200 companies so far to look at how we can support them. Also support them getting through where we can, the valley of death. We know it can be a great idea, we know it can be a great startup, but how do they get beyond a small scale, great idea to power up and grow? And I think the more businesses we can grow in Queensland, the better, particularly homegrown businesses, but the more we can attract as well. Because as we all know, capital knows no boundaries. There are a lot of, the pandemic has required all of us to pivot and to be flexible. Those words we've said a million times so far. But how do we, we're seen as a someone described it as sunny, smart and safe. And that's the Queensland moment. That's the advantage we want to leverage. And so if a business is thinking of moving from a southern state, for example, well, we want to attract them here and make sure we don't lose that first mover advantage of having a safe place for people, to make sure it's a safe place for capital and investment going forward. And so that's what we're looking at trying to attract.
I think one link to that, Treasurer, is labour shortages are a significant issue. What needs to be done to address this? Yeah,
I think, I've spoken about this at a number of forums and with a range of individuals. I think all levels of government really has to look at that skills and training framework to make sure we've got the workforce we need, the unanticipated workforce that we now see there's great demand for. We'll be having a skills summit, skills and employment summit a little bit later on this year to try and look at some of those constraints and how we manage those. How do we use our skills and training programs, back to work, Skilling Queenslanders for Work, to ensure we've got the trained workforce? But it's a real challenge. It's one of the single biggest issues that is presented to government across Queensland, not just in the southeast. So I think we need to do more work there, and we need to be flexible in how we deliver those programs so we can provide the workforce that business and industry needs. But I think all levels of government working together there. Councils have a role to play. Federal government, of course, spends an enormous amount of money on employment programs as well. So making sure we work together to deal with probably the single biggest constraint in our economy is very important.
I think we might just have time for one last question. Is there any last questions from the floor? I think the one be out at the back there.
Thanks very much. Peter Edwards from Archipelago. I thought I'd ask a question to you, Minister, about the little date that's coming up at the end of July and its significance for us in 2032. A one-centre city's lifetime moment. Are there ideas formulating about the impact to Queensland's economy?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's a great question. And again, who would have thought, a year ago we'd be on the cusp of securing the biggest single event in the world, let alone the biggest single sporting event. And that holds huge promise for Queensland. And we're in a pretty good position. Most host cities really only got 7 years advance notice. The IOC generally made a decision 7 years before the Olympics. It was almost 7 years to the day in Sydney from the announcement in 1993 to the Games starting in 2000. We're going to have potentially 11 years to do that, which is basically a whole 4-year forward estimates process. So that will give us time. I mean, we're still recovering from the impact of COVID. I painted a pretty strong and a positive picture here today, which I think I should share with you because I think it is strong and positive. But we know we still haven't recovered. Across the forward estimates, we're still $3 billion down on revenue than we thought we were going to be at the mid-year fiscal and economic review in 1920. So when that was handed down in December 2019. So we're still, it'll take us time to recover. But what a great thing to look forward to galvanise government, to look at that infrastructure, more than 170,000 jobs, I think, billions in economic activity, and then putting Queensland on the map for the world to see, and the dividend that then runs for our state for, literally decades to come. I was just thinking coming here about the Olympics in 1976. Yes, I'm that old. I went down to Mark Lewis's house. It's the first time I saw a colour television for the opening ceremony of the Montreal Olympics. Now, I don't think the Montreal Olympics is something to aspire to. Had a bit of It didn't have a great result for Montreal. But the IOC's learnt from that. It needs to have a flexible, adaptable model, the new norm, which again will benefit Queensland. And the reason it was the first time I'd seen a colour television, as my father said, it's a black and white TV, it's perfectly fine. Why do we need to get a new television? And by the way, can you get up and change it to Channel O? You've got to be it's fair age to know you used to have to change. There was no remote. Even Channel O existed. Anyway, before I lose the audience completely, Paul, and my journey back into the Olympics past, but I've always loved the Olympics. That's a good example of that. I was very, very young, as you can imagine, crawling across the floor almost. Oh, good. Some people got it. I think there's huge potential in that for us, and I think it's an exciting moment for Queensland. And I think Tokyo is going to be tough for competitors. It's going to be tough for the organising committee. It's going to be tough for spectators. But coming out of Paris and Los Angeles, imagine that, two of the great cities of the world, and then coming to the Brisbane Queensland Games, we will call them. I think that's going to be fantastic.
We must be of a similar vintage, Treasurer. I remember the Montreal Games as my first one too.
I thought you were going to deny it completely, Paul, and ask me where Montreal was.
Not quite. So that concludes the Q&A session, which just leaves me to thank the Treasurer for taking time out of his busy schedule. I know you're travelling later on this afternoon. Safe trip. And I'll just invite Tanya back onto stage to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Treasurer, let me begin by thanking you for speaking to CEDA members today and for answering the questions that we put to you frankly and in good spirit. Please accept all our thanks for the work you undertake to deliver good outcomes for Queenslanders and our very best wishes for your work ahead and the bathroom renovation. Our thanks again to our Queensland State Budget major sponsor, Plenary Group, and supporting sponsors Colin, Biggers and Paisley Lawyers and Energy Queensland. Thanks for your support. CEDA will continue to work with its members across the state and across the country to connect, to inform and to influence good economic and social policy outcomes for all Australians. In the coming year, you'll see a very direct and obvious correlation between CEDA's own research and policy agenda to its nationally managed program of work and events, as we seek to answer with you, our members and stakeholders, 5 questions critical to Australia's future prosperity. How can we capture the benefits of technology for all Australians? How can we build well-being in our communities? How can Australia stoke sustained competitive advantage? How do we create dynamic workforces and workplaces? And how can Australia achieve climate resilience and regain our energy advantage? Up next for us, though, Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg releases the Commonwealth's next intergenerational report with us on 28 June via live stream and to a small group of CEDA members in Melbourne. On Wednesday the 14th of July, from Sydney and beamed around the country and right to your computer screen, towards net zero, securing our energy future, with a panel of speakers and the first public address with AEMO's new Chief Executive, Daniel Westerman. If you'd like to know more about the CEDA research, how you can collaborate with us on that or any of our forward work, please get in touch with us directly or visit ceda.com.au, or alternatively come and speak with one of the team here today on your way out. National Associate Director of Program and Innovation, Clint O'Brien, the membership team, Susan Austin and Michelle Cunningham, Carlina James, our Senior Events Manager and works on Clint's national team and who has made the trip from Sydney to help make today happen, and Membership Manager Kirsty Carla. It's Kirsty's first day with CEDA today, And she's come to us from Townsville and Townsville Enterprise Limited to join the CEDA team in what I'd say probably feels like a baptism of fire. And can I just say thanks to the whole team for today's event. On behalf of all at CEDA, thank you for being with us today and in doing so, contributing and supporting the work of the Committee for Economic Development Australia. Go well, be kind, see you all soon. Thank you.